So I wanted to welcome everybody to the first in this year's series of Twilight Talks, which are themed Botanical Bliss. And I can tell you from being involved in this from the beginning and chatting with tonight's speaker, what bliss this will be. We are recording this tonight, just so everybody knows. And if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A feature, and we will certainly get to as many questions as we can. I am Michael Mailer, Regional Site Administrator for Historic New England's Metro Boston region. And in case you already don't know, we have 3 more of these talks coming up over the next 3 Wednesdays. So as I said, both Historic New England and I are very excited this year because our roster of speakers, including tonight's, is really a veritable who's who of the various aspects of botanical pursuits in the Boston area and beyond. Next Wednesday, we're happy to present Designing Mount Auburn, a most pleasing effect on the eye, with speaker Meg Winslow, who's curator of historical collections and archives at Mount Auburn. And she's going to talk about the fascinating story of Mount Auburn's early design and the Boston horticulturalist who created a new American landscape and placed, and I love this, the garden in the grave. The following Wednesday, on November 11th, we're joined by botanist and author Judith Sumner for Ladies in the Field, the Victorian pastimes of botany and gardening. And Judith will take us on a journey into the botanical pursuits of 19th century women, from fanciful lore and home decor to scholarship, study, and design, perfect for the centennial year of the 19th Amendment. The Wednesday after that, on November 18th, we're going to conclude with the Glass Flowers, Marvels of Art and Science, with collections manager Jennifer Brown from Harvard, who's going to share the history of this internationally acclaimed collection and discuss his recent projects. So if you haven't already, you can find these and all of Historic New England's programming on our website at historicnewengland.org. But for now, let's get to the topic of the evening, the Arnold Arboretum. And I'm honored to introduce Lisa Pearson. Lisa is head of Arnold Arboretum's Horticultural Library and Archives and oversees all of its operations. She is a graduate of the School of Library and Information Science at Simmons University. She wears many hats in the library, performing research, using their collections for staff and outside researchers, and creating exhibitions of archival materials for the library and the Arboretum website. She also manages new book and archival acquisitions. Earlier in her time there, she was the project cataloger for the digitization of several historical photograph collections, and she has had the honor to speak about those image collections to audiences in China in 2015 and 2017. So with that, I will turn it over to you, and welcome, and we look forward to hearing you.
Well, thank you so much, Michael. Let me begin sharing my screen here, so bear with me just a moment while I do that. And we want this one here, I believe. So here we are. So anyway, today I'm going to be speaking about the Arnold Arboretum, about its early history. As we approach the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University, I want to reflect upon how the institution was founded. It's a story that actually starts in the early 19th century with 2 Massachusetts merchants, Benjamin Bussie and James Arnold, who made bequests in the middle of that century to encourage education in botany, horticulture, and agricultural science. Through the dedicated work of George Barrell Emerson to effect the marriage of these bequests, Arnold's cash was transferred to Harvard College, where it was joined with Bussie's land to create the Arnold Arboretum on March 29, 1872. However, the institution that we know today did not spring fully formed into existence at that date. No, not at all. It took another 20 years of designing, political wrangling, hard labor, the influence upon Harvard of Asa Gray, the youthful energy of Charles Sprague Sargent, the brilliance of the landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted to bring this living museum to life that we know today. For my remarks on Benjamin Bussie, I'm very much indebted to Mary Jane Wilson's extensive original research in her publication, The Master of Woodland Hill, which was published in 2006. All of the images, unless I've noted otherwise on the screen, are from our own archives at the Arnold Arboretum. So let me start with, let's see here. Hang on a moment. We're having a little technical difficulty. Here we go. Let's try that. we are. Benjamin Bussie. So Benjamin Bussie is a man who came from very modest beginnings in Stoughton, in the part of the town that's actually now split off into the town of Canton. He was the son of Benjamin and Ruth Hartwell Bussie, and he and his three siblings were raised on their family farm and inculcated with the values of thrift and hard work. He began very early to learn his life's work, that of trade, buying and selling, wheeling and dealing, while working in his father's store. When the American Revolution erupted in 1775, young Benjamin was in the Stoughton militia and was with them during their operations in the Boston Harbor Islands. He later became a quartermaster sergeant, a position that let him hone his skills at trade while serving at Ticonderoga and Saratoga. After the war, he apprenticed. Just do this. There we go. He apprenticed with a silversmith who had come to America with the Hessian troops. This man, Jakob Vend, had been captured, and in exchange for his freedom, he agreed to accept Bussie as an apprentice. Bussie evidently was a natural-born craftsman, and you can see some of his work here in the pictures. He learned the trade quickly, and he and Vend then went into business as partners. We see on the right a silver spoon by Bussie that's held in the collections of the MFA, and then a collection of 6 spoons in the Harvard Art Museum's collection that really do show his skill in artistry. He and Venn remained partners for several years, but that siren song of the luxury goods trade proved too strong, and Bussie struck out on his own. He expanded his trade from buying and selling just in the major New England ports to Europe, and in particular to England and France. The types of goods that he dealt in were varied. From America, his ships carried furs and tobacco, and they were traded or sold for cottons and muslins. Those were very popular at the time, but expensive before the cotton gin was introduced. He dealt in printed shawls and Madeira wine, coffee, and even barrels of feathers. We have records for barrels of blue feathers. I assume probably for decorating hats. Jeffersonian trade embargoes severely cut into Bussie's profits. This, and added to concerns from British impressment of his sailors on his merchant ships, caused him to step back from his trading ventures after about 1809. He'd already begun to speculate in real estate and bought from General Henry Knox many thousands of acres of land in what is now Mid-Coast Maine, or what was Mid-Coast Maine then. And at one point, he even owned the better portion of the town of Bangor, Maine. He kept his eyes open, though, for new ventures. And in 1819, he bought a defunct cotton mill in Dedham. He demolished that building and he rebuilt it as a woolen mill, and later added 2 more mills nearby. Now, some of the raw materials for Bussie's mills were provided by Bussie's own flock of fine merino sheep. And this leads me to his estate in Jamaica Plain, which he purchased in 1806 from Eleazar Weld, a descendant of Captain Joseph Weld, who had received the land for his service in the Pequot War. What would grow into over 200 acres, he'd built his grand mansion, which you see here in the photo on the right, called Woodland Hill. And he indulged in a passion that he had for experimental agriculture. Now, for a person who had grown up in a modest surroundings in rural New England, this must have seemed very lavish, but it was similar to other local estates that were also working farms, such as the Vale in Waltham and Pleasant Hill in Charlestown. They were both founded by friends of Bussie, and they were also colleagues of his in the Massachusetts Society for Promoting Agriculture. This organization, which is still in operation today, provided a venue at the time for Massachusetts estate owners to meet and exchange ideas about the latest advances in agricultural science. Bussie, there we go. Bussie took an active role in his work on the farm, managing and also participating in some of the farm work with skills he honed so many years before in Stoughton on his father's farm. He experimented with different plants and he kept careful records of their results. He was also an early adopter of the culture of merino sheep, like we saw there earlier, which had actually only been introduced to America in 1802, the production of which gained a strong foothold during Jefferson's embargoes that I had mentioned earlier. More important for the future of the Arnold Arboretum was Bussie's, then his experimental agriculture ventures, was his work replanting trees, in some cases ornamental specimen trees, on lands much of which had previously been clear cut for lumber. We have records going back to the 17th centuries of sawmills in the Bussie Brook area. And as you step back through the 18th and then to the 17th century, we see the lands divided into a number of small farms. And then before that, the large land grant given to Joseph Weld for his service in the Pequot War. Before that, archaeological remains showed that the land was only very sporadically used by the native people in this area, probably for hunting, during the woodland period of 2000 to 400 years before the present. This is a contemporary painting of Bussie's home and lands that was acquired by the Arboretum in 1989. It shows the mansion in white at the center, and let me see if I can point to that and have it show on the screen. Yes, here we go. So this is his mansion here. And a little further back, this is Bussie Hill here. It's not quite in perspective, but it sort of is. There's a little, as you can see, a little building there at the top. That's his observatory, where he had several telescopes and some couches for observing things. And if you come down here, you'll see a little bit of white fence along South Street. And this is where South Street Gate is today. And if you take a look in, I think in one of the pictures I will show, you will see this particular tree that's showing in beautiful fall color. The painting is inscribed on the back. I have the inscription there on the side. Seat of Benjamin Bussie, Esquire, Roxbury, from Walk Hill by William A. Cobb, autumn of 1839. It's on its reverse. So let me go back over here. There we go. All through the 18 teens and 20s and 30s, Bussie continued in his diverse ventures, the experimental farming, real estate speculation, wool production, as well as many charitable and philanthropic activities. In 1835, at age 87 or age 78, excuse me, he wrote his will, and you can see the bust there is about the time that he did write his will. He made many generous bequests to several schools at Harvard and directed funds and his land in Jamaica Plain to be used to create a school of agriculture to be called the Bussie Institution. Bussie's wife Judith was to have a life tenancy at Woodland Hill and would later live there until her death in 1849. His sole surviving heir, his granddaughter Maria, and her husband Thomas Motley and their 7 children moved in and lived there until 1874, when the property was finally transferred to Harvard. The Bussie Institution had been started in 1871 on an 8-acre portion of the property closest to Forest Hill Station. It's actually the area where the State Laboratories building is today. Thomas Motley instructed students in farming at the Bussie. During his lifetime and in the period of tenancy of his heirs, visitors were welcome to his property to enjoy the beauty of the grounds, something quite unusual in that time period. Hemlock Hill in particular was quite popular, probably to its accessibility to public transportation, a train station having been constructed at Forest Hills in the 1830s. So public transportation and the Arboretum go back a very, very long way. Harriet Manning Whitcomb wrote in 1897, and I quote, "During Mr. Bussie's life, and for years after, the public enjoyed the freedom of these charming grounds. There were lovely wooded paths, carefully kept in all directions. Here was a rustic bridge spanning the jocund brook, there a willow-watered pond, home of gold and silver fish. This path wound back and forth to the summit of Hemlock Mountain. There was an arbor with seats for resting, surrounded by majestic trees, and where lovely vistas of the distant hills and near a valley could be enjoyed." End quote. I think this photo on the left from the Arboretum archive sums up Whitcomb's sentiments very well. Now I'll leave off here for now with this idyllic image of the Bussie property and turn to the other great benefactor of the Arnold Arboretum, James Arnold of New Bedford. And there he is. So Arnold was born in Providence, Rhode Island, but as a young man migrated to New Bedford to join the firm of William Roch, who was a noted whaling merchant, and whose father, Joseph Roch, founded the whaling industry in that town for all intents and purposes. There he rose in the business and became a partner and married Roch's granddaughter, Sarah. Good way to make your way in business. The Roch Company dealt in whale oil. And from that from sperm whales and right whales, as well as the prize spermaceti from the heads of the sperm whales. Beyond this, though, and this is where they really made their money, they diversified their business to include owning the ships that hunted the whales and delivered the oil, owning the warehouses where the oil was kept, owning the shipyards where the ships were built, owning the cordage company where they made the ropes for the ships, owning the wharves where the ships were docked, and even owning the candle company that made the candles out of the spermaceti. In 1821, Arnold decided to build a large house in New Bedford, befitting his wealth and station, and he purchased 10 acres in the center of town for his new home and for gardens. The house and a small portion of the grounds are still extant in New Bedford as the Olmstedian Club, which is a private club, but they also have a group that is working to restore the grounds as best that they can. He was very proud of his estate, and it would appear that his wife Sarah had a lot to do with the garden design. Like Benjamin Bussie, he also opened his grounds to the public regularly. And again, I suspect Sarah, who seemed to have a very charitable streak in her, had a hand in that as well. The Arnold Mansion was called, and I quote, a home for the most conspicuous among our homes for culture, for hospitality, for charity, end quote. And again, I think much of this was due to Sarah's generosity. Like Benjamin Bussie and other well-heeled landowners in the period, Arnold was a member of various horticultural organizations. He was a founder of the New Bedford Horticultural Society and a longtime member of the Massachusetts Horticultural Society. As Arnold approached the end of his life, and we see him in the right-hand photograph very late in his life, he made his will, and it is to one of his executors, his brother-in-law, George Barrell Emerson, that we will next turn. Is Mr. Emerson. Now, Emerson really, I feel like he's a fascinating person who deserves to be better known. He was a second cousin to Ralph Waldo Emerson and was born in Wells, Maine in 1797. He developed deep love of plants in his childhood while exploring his family farm and the environs, and immediately sought out the resources of the Botanic Garden when he matriculated at Harvard College. On graduation, he became a schoolmaster and a pioneer in the education of girls, having opened the Emerson School for Girls in Boston in 1823. On the right is a rare daguerreotype of a classroom in his school, circa about 1850, from the collections at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. I believe that man seated on the right side may very well be him, albeit a much younger image than the very stern visage that we have in the engraving on the left. In 1832, his first wife died, and he remarried in 1834 to the widow Mary Roch Fleming. Recognize that Roch name, Sarah Arnold's sister. This brought him into the orbit of the Arnold family. Emerson was active in the scientific community of Boston and was one of the founders of the Boston Society of Natural History. During his presidency of the organization in 1837, the membership undertook a series of surveys for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts plants and animals. Emerson produced the volume of the state's trees entitled, this was a long one, A Report on the Trees and Shrubs Growing Naturally in the Forests of Massachusetts. During his summer vacations from school, he worked on this and finally published in 1846. And in fact, in the dedication, the opening comments in the book, he apologizes for having it take so long for him to write this because he could only work on it during his vacation time. As well as describing individual species of trees, he was also very much an advocate in its pages of forest management and conservation, almost a half a century before these movements really began to gain traction with foresters. Harvard offered Emerson the Fisher Professorship in Natural History around this time, but he turned them down. The position was filled a short time later by Asa Gray, whom Emerson became great friends with. A bit about Gray to place him in context. He was born in New York State, again of modest circumstances, and trained as a physician, but only practiced for a very short time, and instead became a protege of botanist John Torrey. It was work with Torrey and other activities in the natural sciences community that led to his appointment as the Fisher Professor in 1842. He is considered the father of American botany and instrumental in unifying the knowledge of plants of North America in his Manual of the Botany of the Northern United States from New England to Wisconsin and south to Ohio and Pennsylvania inclusive. This is known as Gray's Manual, to make it much shorter, and has gone through 8 editions and remains a standard in the field. At Harvard, he taught and managed the Harvard Botanic Garden in Cambridge, and you see a photograph of it here on the right, circa about 1890 or so. By donating his book and immense plant collection, oops, oh dear, that's what I get for leaning on the button too much. There we go. He donated his plant collection, which numbered in the thousands of specimens, and effectively created the botany department at Harvard. The Grey Herbarium, which is today part of the Harvard University Herbaria, is named after him. Grey was an early supporter in America of Charles Darwin, with whom he kept up a decades-long correspondence on the theory of evolution. And it was Grey who first reviewed On the Origin of Species in an American journal. He was the first botanist to recognize the similarities between the flora of Eastern North America and Eastern Asia, a concept that today is known as disjunct floras. And this would become hugely important for us at the Arboretum in the early 20th century when we sent plant explorers to collect specimens of this flora for inclusion in our living collections. It may also have been Asa Gray who planted the idea of a public arboretum in George Emerson's mind. Gray supported the idea of an arboretum to supplement the botanic garden collections, but it might have been also Emerson himself who settled on the idea. We don't know for sure. Various locations were considered, including the grounds of the Harvard Observatory, as well as an area along the Charles where the Harvard Stadium stands today, but these were all rejected. Gray was also familiar with the Bussie parcel, and although it was about 4 miles from campus, and as I say, as someone who works at the Arboretum and has to go over to campus sometimes, it sometimes seems like 4,000 miles. But it would be large enough, though, in that area to do justice to the complete collection of temperate woody plants. James Arnold made his will in 1860, and in drafting the will, the lawyer Francis Parker, who was one of the trustees, structured it so that it was to be divided in several large parts and then further subdivided into a number of bequests of varying sizes to relations and to friends. 1 1/4 of one of these larger divisions was reserved in trust with Parker, Emerson, and John James Dixwell, as trustees. It read thus, quote, in trust to be applied for the promotion of agriculture or horticultural improvements or other philosophical or philanthropic purposes at their discretion, and to provide for the continuance of the trust hereafter to such persons, and on such conditions as they, or a majority of them, may deem proper to carry out the intention of the donor. The deposition of the funds in the trust were left to the trustees, but their future actions were guided by the extensive discussions that they had had with Arnold during his lifetime concerning his wishes. Now, just the next slide. Here we go. During this time, Harvard finally acted upon Benjamin Bussie's will to create the Bussie Institution. A fine neo-Gothic building was constructed, which opened in 1871, which we see in these 2 photographs. It may have been the higher profile of Bussie's lands received at the time that pushed them into the forefront as a desirable location for the new Arboretum. Of course, it also may have been the fact that the university would not have had to purchase any additional property to accommodate the foundation of the institution. Whatever the case, on March 29, 1872, the indenture was signed between the trustees and Harvard to convey Arnold's bequest to the university and to create a public arboretum. I'd like to quote from several of the important points. The establishment and support of an arboretum to be called the Arnold Arboretum, which shall contain, as far as practicable, all the trees, shrubs, and herbaceous plants, either indigenous or exotic, that can be raised in the open air in the said West Roxbury. We have dropped, I will just editorialize, we have dropped the herbaceous plants for the most part, and it's just trees and shrubs these days. And it goes on, for the support of a professor to be called the Arnold Professor, who shall have the care and management of the said arboretum, and who shall teach the knowledge of trees in the university. And as the entire fund, increased by the accumulations above named, under the best management and with the greatest economy, is barely sufficient to accomplish the proposed object, it is expressly provided that it shall not be diminished by supplementing any other object, however meritorious or kindred in its nature. So in 1873, this man, Charles Sprague Sargent, was appointed the director of the new Arboretum. He was born in Boston in 1841 to an old Brahmin family and graduated from Harvard College in 1862. He served in the Union Army in the Civil War and was brevetted a major by the end of the conflict. From 1865 to 1868, he made a tour of the gardens of Europe, and this photo here dates from about that time, and then returned to Boston to manage his father's estate in Brookline. He guided the Arboretum with a firm hand, or dare I say an iron hand, some people would say that, until his death 54 years later. During that time, he oversaw the design and building of the Arboretum landscape in our living collections. He directed a census of all the trees in North America. He conducted the publication of Garden and Forest. He traveled the world. He created a Silva of North America in 14 volumes and engaged collectors to bring back thousands of plants to grow in the Arnold Arboretum. Very soon, though, after Sargent became director, he brought in Frederick Law Olmsted for a short visit to look over the landscape and to draw up a proposal for planning and the design of the grounds. I sometimes joke that Olmsted must have come incognito in dark glasses and a hat, but this is only half in jest. At that time, Olmsted was very well known and a highly respected landscape architect who was just ending his association with Calvert Vaux, New York. He and Vaux had designed and directed the building of Manhattan Central Park and a number of other notable design projects. Olmsted's initial introduction to the Arboretum landscape was obviously a success. Sargent soon sought out funding to engage Olmsted and his firm and to use them to create a design for the Arnold Arboretum. In his 1877-1878 report to the president of Harvard, Sargent reports that Olmsted, quote, volunteered to make a plan embracing his ideas of the best method of attaining these ends, which he agreed were essential, end quote. And all for $2,000, about $50,000 today. And I think they really got their money's worth. Among the subscribers Sargent's listed to pay for the venture were friends and relations. Ignatius Sargent, that's Charles's father, the owner of that estate in Brookline, he subscribed $300. H. Honeywell, who was a cousin and would later go on to fund the construction of the Honeywell building at the Arboretum, who also subscribed $300. Henry Winthrop Sargent, who was another cousin, he was the owner of an estate along the Hudson River, the picturesque design of which was influential to the young Charles Sargent. He subscribed $100. And a name we've heard before, George Barrell Emerson, who also subscribed $100. Next slide here. So Olmsted and his firm worked from mid-1878 through 1885, creating and refining the design of the Arboretum landscape. Topographic maps were created to better understand the shape of the land. Of prime importance was the design of the road system. Sargent's preference was for the longest circular road that could be devised, but the shape of the property, being very long and narrow, just couldn't accommodate it. And you see from this topographic map, it doesn't quite even do justice to the great longness and narrowness of our land. It is extended in both directions, on the right and the left, in these present days. Orienting you on the map, and please, again, pardon my wobbly lines. We have on the lower right here, that's the plot of the Bussie Institution. We've got Arnold's house and outbuildings for his farm there. And then we see here, kind of in the upper center, a squarish shape, or at least square along the top, of Bussie's lilac hedge, which is something that we may see again here. So we're fortunate to have in our archives high resolution photographs of Olmsted's plans and studies from this period. We see him trying to adhere to his charge for a circular drive by snaking it across the landscape and up to the tops of Bussie and Hemlock Hills before returning to the entrance. Let me go back here. Before returning to the entrance of the northernmost part of the grounds. And to orient you again, north is in this way, south is down here. And you see the drive going kind of through the center of the meadow and, up and around and circling back and forth and all these crazy things, and no outlet over on this side at all, out onto Bussie Street. So we see the next plan. This first plan is from June of 1879. It would have lots of ascending and descending. And the next one we have here we go, is a little more refined. This was from August of 1879, and we see that sharp climb up the hill is not there. It's kind of circling around the back side of Bussie Hill and then sort of up and circling around to the top there and continuing to go back and forth. But it's a little bit more moderate. The turn of the new year of 1880, the studies change and the road system, almost as we know it today, emerges. And you can see here, gone is the artificial circular drive, and the road's now free to follow the contours of the landscape, hugging the North Meadow here, and kind of is dipping down further into the North Meadow than it does today, but then circling about and coming up, starting up to ascend the north side of Bussie Hill here, continuing to circle around to the top of Bussie Hill with a turnaround, but then coming down and following along what is now Valley Road and down past what is now the Oak Collection in here, and then teeing out down here to South Street Gate, and then continuing along here in what is Hemlock Hill Road and out to Walter Street here. It shows, interestingly, a little road to the top of Hemlock Hill with a little turnaround here, which was never put in, which I think is okay. So by November of 1880, the design was complete and it was ready to present to the public. And this map was issued at that time and was titled Proposition as to a Public Ground to Include Harvard Arboretum. Meadow roads shifted a bit, as we can see here, shifted a bit more to the left-hand side on this drawing, but it's nearly the same as the revision at the beginning of the year. Olmsted and Sargent worked closely to devise a planting arrangement which took into account the botanical sequence that recently had been published by George Bentham and Joseph Hooker in their Genera Plantarum. The sequence, which we still more or less adhere to today, is classified plants by their flowering structures. The simpler the structure, the more primitive and therefore older, and then which would put it at the beginning of the sequence starting at what is now the Honeywell building and continuing along the drive, along to the end, to the outlet of the grounds. Our plan photographs in our collection, let me just shift to the next plan. Here we go. Include an extensive set of plant distribution studies, and like the road designs, they show Olmsted's and Sargent's thoughts on the placement of plants in the landscape. Now, this is actually turned around completely from the last picture I showed you. North is going in that direction. Honeywell building would be here. We see Meadow Road, and we see actually the acers, the maples, are placed on the, if you're traveling towards Forest Hills on the right side of Meadow Road, they're now in this area on the left in here. And we see Prunus and Pyrus, the pears and the cherries, are here on the slope of Bussie Hill. This area is Forsythia today. They're actually over in here now in the Bradley Rosaceous collection. So this doesn't quite reflect how things have shaken out. And in fact, this area along in here, you'll all know very well if you've been to Lilac Sunday, because that's the slope the lilacs are on in the collection. Sargent must have realized very quickly after becoming director that Arnold's bequest, although extremely generous, would not begin to cover all of the expenses required to build his arboretum. Plants were foremost, but the infrastructure costs had to be taken into account as well. The property needed a perimeter wall, the roads were required to move the visitors across the landscape, sewers would be needed to drain excess water, all much more expensive than the Arnold nest egg would provide. Then there was also would be ongoing maintenance of the hardscape once it was installed. Where was he going to find all that kind of money? Well, he just changed my screen. There we go. He conceived of a partnership between Harvard and the city of Boston that would require Sargent to convince the university to give something away. That was a challenging proposition, I would say, and convince the city to accept it. I would dare say even a more difficult proposition. Olmsted was on board with the plan immediately, and in fact, Sargent later ascribed in one of his reports to the president of Harvard that the idea was Olmsted's, perhaps to make it more palatable in certain quarters. But it seems to me that the original notion was probably actually Sargent's. The proposal was first floated in 1878 to interested parties in the university and the city. Sargent, ever the persuasive negotiator, began a campaign to convince and cajole by letter and in person park commission officials, city councilors, and university bigwigs to encourage them to agree to the proposition. In his 1880 to 1881 report to the president of the university, one can sense his rising exasperation, where he says, "No progress has been made during the year in permanently arranging or planting the arboretum. This work has again been delayed by the failure of the government of the city of Boston to adopt the recommendation of the park commissioners for a joint occupancy of the arboretum by the city and the college." The city council didn't bring the proposal to a vote until October of 1882, and that vote didn't pass. Sargent and Olmsted then sprang into action. They mounted a media blitz in the local press to try to sway public opinion and that of the city council in favor of a plan. The petition was circulated among the most prominent citizens of the city, and it gathered 1,300 signatures in support, actually a little more than that. When the measure came up again before the city council on the 27th of December, the vote passed. Of course, it would take almost another year to iron out all the terms, but on December 20th of 1883, the indenture was finally signed between Harvard and Boston. In it, the university agreed to give the land to the city, but would lease it back on a 1,000-year lease with, and the director of the Arboretum always likes to point this out, with the option for one renewal. So we have the possibility that the Arnold Arboretum could have 2,000 years of leasing from the city of Boston. All this for $1 a year. The city agreed to construct the infrastructure at a cost not to exceed $75,000, excuse me, and that's $75,000 in 1882 dollars. And the university, for its part, agreed to be open to the public at all reasonable times and abide by the park rules. Go on here. Work could finally begin. So the city laborers started at Center Street Gate, and they began to lay out the work along Valley Road, and they nearly completed the task when progress ground to a halt again due to a change in the park department administration. No doubt Sargent was living in that, I'm sure in his Boston Brahmin kind of way. His propagator, Jackson Dawson, had been hard at work growing on all the plants and seeds that they'd received from all over the world. And in 1880, 1881 alone, it's reported in his report to the president of Harvard, they received no less than 2,625 plants and 310 packets of seeds, that year alone. And the other years up to that point, they were receiving similar amounts of plants and seeds. Pardon me while I as you can see, the nurseries were packed to overflowing. And although the road construction was halted, several large planting outs were able to occur. One in the 1886 season, which helped ease the bursting nursery. The majority of the ashes, the elms, the catalpas, the birches, the hickories, the hop hornbeams, and the beeches were planted out in 1886. And of the conifers, the pines, the spruces, and the larches were put in, as well as other specimen trees. Then the 1887 season saw the planting of the oaks, the walnuts, the araucaria, and the chestnuts. Further planting was halted, though, due to the lack of progress on the roads. And we see here in the pictures. Remember that large elm that I pointed out in Bussie's, the painting of Bussie's property? Well, there it is, right there. This is South Street Gate area. The work being, done with horses and carts and men with picks and shovels. And then we see a very early photograph of the spruce collection, taken in 1899 in the winter in January of 1889. They're just very small at that point, but all set out almost like a plantation in little rows. So let me move on here. Here we go. So, in fact, no work was actually done on the roads until 1889, when Hemlock Hill and Meadow roads were begun. And as if to prove that construction was progressing, the Parks Department sent out a photographer at intervals to record the laborers at their work. And you can see them here, working with picks and shovels, and just using carts and wheelbarrows to move the ground. No earth movers, no cats, caterpillars, nothing, no front end loaders. This work was all done by hand, which I think is even more remarkable. We also see here the summit of Bussie Hill. This is looking almost west to east. And you can see the drive that circles around up to the very top, but there is not a tree to be seen. If you look at this today, this is all treed. If you know the Arboretum at all, the Explorer's Garden, what used to be Chinese Path, comes off just about here. And this is all, though, just bare of plantings. The plantings haven't gone in here. The oak collection is kind of over in this area. The photos here, let's see. Oh, yes. Let me go on to my next slide, because this is remarkable as well. Yes, here we are. So on the left, we see a photograph of Bussie Hill after it was plowed and cultivated in October of 1890. And if you'll notice here, you notice the stakes in the ground, and we have stakes, we have a line of stakes here. This is laying out the path of Bussie Hill Road. This photo on the right is a long shot, a long view of that same area taken on the same day. And you see across the midline of the photo right here, this is Meadow Road, and it circles around, and you can see that Bussie Hill Road is just being started along here. I think that the photo on the left is just about at this point, looking in this direction here. Across the midline, or across above the midline there of the photo, the upper part, you will see a dark line, and this dark line of plants, and that is Bussie's lilac hedge that I pointed out on the topographic map that we looked at earlier. A few of these plants, actually, a few of these lilacs still survive today, believe it or not, after nearly 200 years. So these photos for our visual archives also show, let me just click on here, what must have been just backbreaking work. You can see that all of this work is being done by hand with picks and shovels. These men are working with picks and shovels here in the back. The only piece of mechanized equipment in any of them is this steamroller right here. And I think it is literally a steam-powered steamroller. But all the rest of the work, all of this work that would be done with a crane today is all being craned with blocks and tackles and pulleys, all to work on the drainage right here where Goldsmith Brook goes through. But all this work is all being done by hand. Now in this photograph, which was taken in the summer of 1892, we see the newly completed Honeywell building here. This was a gift, as I mentioned, of H. Honeywell, and it cost $30,000 in 1892 dollars, which is about 860,000 in modern day funds. It was designed by Longfellow, Alden, and Harlow architects. And if you notice here on the very back side, it may be hiding under your speaker screen, that the back L, the back portion of the building, is not present. That wasn't added until 1909. So to conclude, for all intents and purposes, the Arboretum was complete by 1892. The trees and shrubs were in place, infrastructure was finished, the public could enjoy the landscape in their carriages, on horseback or on foot. More property would be added very soon after, when we added the Peters Hill tract and the reservation at the top of Bussie Hill. And then about a century later, when the Bussie Meadow adjacent to the Forest Hills tea station would swell the acreage further. But in 1892, the landscape was complete, and Charles Sargent, I'm sure, could heave a well-deserved sigh of relief at a job well done. Thank you so much. I'll stop my sharing here. There we are.
Thank you, Lisa. That's was very, very interesting and fascinating, and a rare glimpse. I think some of those photos are pretty amazing of that we normally would not get to see by just visiting the Arboretum. So there are a few questions for you if you're ready to take them.
Oh, I'm happy to.
So Francis was asking, was inquiring about the cemetery on the Walter side of the Arboretum.
Yes. So I actually didn't speak on that, but that is a very early cemetery. That space, that cemetery space, originally had a meeting house next to it. It actually came from the early in the very end of the 17th century. The local residents in Jamaica Plain decided that they really wanted a meeting house that was not 3 miles away in Roxbury, in the center of Roxbury, and so they petitioned the powers that be. That was turned out, no, you may not have your own meeting house. And then they went and built a meeting house anyway. And I guess on the theory that it's easier to ask forgiveness than ask permission, that they built a meeting house. Meeting house was there. It was later disassembled and moved much further down Center Street into what is West Roxbury today, but the burial ground remained. The wall that had separated it from the Arboretum grounds itself was removed in the 20th century, and we care for it today as part of the Arboretum grounds, and is a historical scenic burying ground.
Great. Okay. Ken is asking if there's a relationship between Singer Sargent and Charles Sargent. Yes,
indeed. They're actually third cousins, and they looked remarkably alike too. John Singer Sargent was probably a decade and a half younger than Charles Sprague Sargent. But they did meet a few times during their lives, and we actually have some photographs that were taken in the 1920s. Charles Sprague Sargent was quite elderly at that point, but the two of them meeting and having their picture taken together. So it's very nice.
Great. And Lisa, also from Ken, I think he's referring to the 1892 backbreaking work. If the Arboretum has any information on who those laborers were they immigrant families that were here, or do we know anything about the men who were actually doing that work?
We don't know about the laborers who were doing that work. Those were city employees, but we do have the names of some of the laborers who worked on our grounds very early on, who were employed by Jackson Dawson, our propagator. We do actually have the names of some of those men. Some were Irish, some were Italian, and we see them. There's one man from whom Jackson Dawson usually always rented a horse and cart when they needed to move plants out onto the grounds, and no doubt he put the word out to the laborers to come, and we have more planting to do. And I will say today we have a professional horticultural crew of about 15 employees who manage our grounds all year round.
Great. Okay. And from Nicole, what happened to the Bussie institution?
So the Bussie Institution, it switched from being an undergraduate program to a graduate program around about 1908. My memory is a little fuzzy, and it was a graduate program in genetics. They were doing various work in genetics there. But it was a place, interestingly enough, that students could come, because we're not a degree granting part of Harvard University, we couldn't instruct students here directly that were pursuing degrees, but the Bussie Institution could. And so students would come, matriculate at the Bussie, and then do their study with various members of our staff on the Arboretum grounds. And that in particular was a man named John George Jack, who was a great educator, in particular of Chinese students who came in the early 20th century to study botany. They came because, as one student expressed in 1917, it would take him a lifetime of going all around China to see all the Chinese plants that were gathered together all in one place at the Arnold Arboretum.
All right. Let's see, from Michelle, when was the concept of the emerald necklace conceived, and how did the Arnold Arboretum play into it?
Oh, well, the name the emerald necklace, I think, is a somewhat more recent name. However, the idea of this chain of parks actually goes back to this time. We became part of the Boston Park system, but the other parks along the Boston Park system were being designed at this time by the Olmsted firm as well. So it's this chain of parks encircling the city actually goes back to the earliest planning of the Boston Park system. There's a very good book actually that I would direct people to by a woman by the name of Cynthia Zizewski, called Frederick Law Olmsted and the Boston Park System. And it's an extensive study of the subject and very, very good. It's a reference I use myself.
Great. Okay. And from Ken, I'm sure all seasons have their benefits, but what season do you recommend to visit?
Well, we're very focused at the Arboretum because of our lilacs on the springtime, and certainly the progression of bloom through the rosaceous plants, and then first in the forsythias, then through the rosaceous plants, and then the lilacs, and on to the laurels, and everything is wonderful with the spring and very early summer. But to be honest, I love the fall, and it's a time of year that we perhaps don't recognize quite as much as we do the springtime and Lilac Sunday and all those sorts of things. So I really love the fall. In fact, I have a poster next to my office that dates to the early 20th century that had originally hung in Forest Hill Station when it was the elevated line, that says, "See the crabapple trees," and it's got beautiful pictures of hanging pendulous branches with lots of beautiful little red crab apples on it. And it's, they recognized it then. I wish we recognized it more now.
Great. Well, I know that at least one other attendee, and probably several others, have already decided that we need lilac hedges. So I think that's for future pursuit.
Wonderful.
So just a couple of quick numbers that Ken was looking for too. How large is the entire Arboretum staff, and how many people visit a year?
So the staff it varies a little bit from season to season because we have internship programs. In particular, we have a summer program, the Isabella Wells Honeywell internship program, that swells our ground staff by usually about 10 to 15 student interns per year. But we're at about 70 or so employees at the present time. And that includes our curation staff, our plan giving staff, membership development, our visitor services staff, the library staff, the horticultural staff, and our various people, some of the people that support our labs over in our Weld Hill facility. The labs and the teaching facilities there are part of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences of Harvard. So they're separate, but they're part of our Arboretum family too.
Okay, and thanking you for a great talk. Do you have sergeant's diaries, or were they destroyed?
We do not have sergeant's diaries. I wish we had diaries of sergeant. I wish we had more correspondence from sergeant. I suspect that some of these things were at his home, the estate Homely over in Brookline, which after his death was sold off. Unfortunately, the land divided. The Sargent estates over in Brookline are what remains of that today. And I suspect if there was anything, it might have gone with the family. And I have met some of Sargent's descendants, and his great-granddaughter in particular might well be the holder of that, but she's in France, so and she's very elderly, so it is perhaps not so easy to get at, but sadly there isn't. But he left many other writings, in particular his publication Garden and Forest, that he conducted the publication of from 1888 through 1897. That's a little bit like a diary because it includes all his kind of much of his thinking there, and then his other publications later on.
Great. All right. And I think Nicole is asking a follow-up to the what happened to the Bussie institution question.
Oh, yes.
Saying the buildings of the school or the mansions were let go eventually, and the school dissolved.
So the school was finally, part of it was taken. I'm sorry, but I didn't finish this. The land, part of the land was taken by eminent domain during the Second World War. Some of it had been used previous to that for development of the diphtheria antitoxin, and then some of the land was used during the Second World War. Things kind of struggled on into the 1950s, but then there was the whole issue of the controversy of dividing the Arboretum collections in the 1950s, which ended up at the Supreme Judicial Court in the 1960s. But the Bussie institution had been stopped by then. The land was then claimed by the state, and the state laboratories building was built where that lovely neo-Gothic building stood. That building burned in the late 1960s, I think the late 1960s. Unfortunately, it was just on the cusp before historic preservation really kind of got going, at least around here, it seems like. And it was never saved. It was a beautiful old building, but it was torched by arsonists. And then it was knocked down, knocked flat, and the horrible soul-sucking state laboratories building was built in its place. And that's how the land is the state laboratories complex today.
And that segues into Christine asking who was the architect of what is being termed the ugly state lab in Old Bussie Institute.
I don't know who the architect, I'd have to actually dig into our paper archives. I don't know who the architect's of the original Bussie got Neo-Gothic building where it was. Heaven knows who designed the State Labs building that's there now. Yuck. I feel like it's soul sucking.
Well, great. I think we're at the end of our hour, and I think we've addressed just about all the questions. But Lisa, if somebody wants to visit the Arboretum, it's currently open.
It is. Our grounds are open, and they have been actually through all the pandemic. They are open from dawn till dusk, 365 days a year. Unfortunately, our library is not open to the public right now, but we are available online. And if you go to the Arboretum website and just put in the little search box in the upper right-hand corner, library, and it'll take you right to our pages. And we're happy to answer any questions. I can give our website or our library email address is hortlib, HORTLIB, at arnarb, that's ARNARB.harvard.edu. And please drop us a note. We're happy to talk, and there it is. We're happy to chat with you and answer any questions that you might have. And we have extensive visual archives that are available through Hollis Images. If you search on the Harvard Library's website, I believe it's images.hollis.harvard.edu. All of these photographs of the grounds, or many of the photographs of the grounds that I showed, about 1,500 of them are available online, free, open to the public. Anybody can access them.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Lisa, very much. And thank you all for attending. And we hope to see you at next week's talk with Meg Winslow, Designing Mount Auburn. So Lisa, thank you very, very much for a wonderful talk and for kicking off the series for us. And with that, we'll say good night to everybody and thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye, everyone.